Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, my name is Bernadette, and perhaps I should start my presentation by saying that I was a member of the Hungarian Parliament between 2012 and 2022, which means that I had the chance to closely monitor the growth of Chinese influence in Hungary. I saw the government's decisions up close, I asked for information about them, and I experienced what kind of secrecy surrounds Hungarian-Chinese relations. In Hungary, not only tax-paying citizens, but also members of the parliament do not have access to information that would be self-evident in a democracy. I used to say that I sat in court hearings more than in parliament, because I also had to litigate for basic information and data of public interest. A good example is the case of the Chinese loan taken out in the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. It took me 2 years to find out in court that the Hungarian government had hidden the details of the Chinese loan from Hungarian taxpayers at the request of China. According to the foreign minister, Hungarian interests are equal to Chinese interests, and the Hungarian Supreme Court, the Curia, also agreed with this. I think this case clearly shows that the current Hungarian government does not differentiate between national and Chinese interests. And this leads to making deals with China that do not serve Hungarian interests, but as I saw rather the interests of the Chinese Communist Party and certain Hungarian economic groups close to the government. Taxpayers can pay, but they can't ask. I say it quite often. But let's start from the beginning. When Viktor Orbán came to power in 2010, he announced the Eastern Opening policy. He said, "We sail under the Western flag, but today the wind blows from the East in the global economy. We need to adjust our sails accordingly." The Eastern Opening meant not only the continuation of the pragmatic foreign economic policy of the previous government, but also a marked foreign policy turn. The essence of the new doctrine was that the previous value-based foreign policy was replaced by an interest-based foreign policy, which does not deal with ideological issues. But over time it became clear that the Chinese-Hungarian relationship goes far beyond non-ideological pragmatic relations. On the one hand, deals were made that were not economically rational and contrary to the national interest. And on the other hand, the Eastern Opening became a political ideological program. It quickly became clear that Viktor Orbán had much bigger plans with economic cooperation as a tool, to gain greater influence in world politics and to form a political ideological counterweight within the European Union. This assessment of the situation is supported by the fact that the first 10 years of the Eastern Opening were an economic failure. The promised Chinese investments did not come, and there were many projects that only served Chinese interests. Now I list 5 of them. The first was the residency bonds program. The essence of this program, introduced in 2013, was that non-EU business people could obtain residency rights in Hungary, so in the EU area, for 250 to 300,000 euros. Nearly 20,000 people participated, 16,000 of whom came from China. The program did not contribute to financing the national debt and resulted in losing approximately 80 million euros from taxpayers' money. Meanwhile, the government-affiliated, mostly offshore companies operating and organizing this program made a profit of approximately 160 million euros at the expense of the state budget. The other economically unreasonable project is the Budapest-Belgrade railway project. Hungary was the first country among the EU member states which joined to the initiative New Silk Road, and in 2014 the country agreed with China and Serbia to renovate the Budapest-Belgrade railway. The goal of this was to ensure that Chinese goods could reach Western Europe from the port of Piraeus in Greece as quickly as possible by rail. The Budapest-Belgrade railway project lacks any economic rationale from the Hungarian side. The about €2 billion project is massively overpriced, 85% financed by Chinese loans, largely built with Chinese companies. Unfortunately, I cannot give you much more details because the loan agreement was encrypted for 10 years. The next project I wanted to show you is from 2018. It is the Hungarian campus of Chinese Fudan University that would also be built with Chinese loans at the cost of about 1.5 billion euros. This university project would receive state subsidies equivalent to the entire Hungarian higher education budget. Its operation would be entrusted to a wealth management foundation which would have a control over a vast amount of assets, which means this money would no longer be public money. Moreover, the university would be built instead of a new and important initiation, the so-called Student Town program, which would provide thousands of young people with cheap dormitory accommodation. Since there were huge demonstrations and protests against the Fudan University, the project was stopped for the time being. The fourth deal comeback took place during the COVID era in 2020. At the outbreak of the pandemic, the government decided to invest in Chinese breathing machines. Despite the obvious lack of medical staff, they purchased 17,000 machines, heavily overpriced. Not long after, the documents of the suspicious transaction were destroyed, so taxpayers could not get to know them. The Hungarian government also purchased Chinese vaccines significantly overpriced. They bought the Sinopharm vaccine for twice of the price of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Over 1 million people in Hungary were vaccinated with it, mostly over the age of 60, while the vaccine has not been tested on elderly people. Based on the decision of the foreign minister, the government approved the use of the vaccine without a pharmaceutical test and kept all data secret that revealed the effectiveness of the vaccine. My fifth example is the case of battery factories. Although the government refers to it as an economic success story, in fact, it is a case of factory construction on a scale that is difficult to justify economically and socially. In 2022, the government announced that it reached an agreement with the Chinese battery manufacturer CATL about the establishment of a factory. The government provides a huge state support exceeding 10% of the 7.3 billion euros investment cost. In addition to large-scale state support, the problem is that the conditions for battery production are simply not in place. Water, energy, and labor are bottlenecks, and all three are scarcely available in Hungary. For example, the government would build 2 gas power plants for the energy needs of the factory, for which it would import gas from Russia. This is completely irrational. These 5 projects clearly show that the current Chinese-Hungarian relationship cannot be described as mutually beneficial pragmatic cooperation. Rather, the situation is that this unequal relationship unilaterally serves Chinese interests and the economic interests of certain political groups in Hungary. China can count on the Hungarian government not only to assert its own economic interests, but also to increase its political influence in the EU. We can observe that the Hungarian government constantly weakens unified European action for China's sake. Since the 2010s, the Hungarian government has vetoed every single critical resolution related to China without any consideration, whether it is the oppression of the Uyghur minority or the suppression of democracy in Hong Kong. According to the Hungarian foreign minister, it is pointless to condemn China for its understanding of human rights, because it only harms good relations. What we see is that the policy of the Eastern opening so far does not serve the interests of the Hungarian people, either politically or economically. It is also clear for us that the damages of this more than pragmatic friendship between Orbán and the CCP are going to hurt Hungary both short-time and long-range as well. The pattern we see is that the current Hungarian foreign policy undermines the unity of Europe and also harms Hungarians. Hungary is getting increasingly isolated within the Western alliance system and the narrower East Central European region. In the meanwhile, unfavorable Eastern loans, huge investments stuffed with public money, corrupt deals favorable to the oligarchs are also disadvantages for Hungarian people. Also, dependence on the Eastern powers in the field of economic and energy policy makes the country vulnerable. This was clearly shown at the latest by COVID times, where the disruption of global supply chains led to the need to shut down or reduce production in several car factories, and by the war that clearly showed that Putin uses gas as a political weapon to manipulate energy prices on the continent. Experiencing these cataclysms, Europe faced similar difficulties but reached different conclusions than Hungary. The keyword is safety, economic and national security. The EU has radically reduced its imports of Russian gas from 40% before the war to around 9%, and now is working on a de-risking strategy toward China as well. According to the latest announcement, they will take market protection steps by launching an anti-subsidy investigation against Chinese car manufacturers. In contrast, the Hungarian government pretends that the last few years never happened. This year it signed additional gas contracts with Moscow, while 95% of Hungarian gas imports already came from Russia, and continues to plan the construction of new nuclear power plants units with Rosatom with Russian credit. And as for China, in addition to battery factories, China's influence had increased in the past year in strategic sectors such as the banking and energy sectors. While the lesson of the crisis in the EU is greater sovereignty and less vulnerability, Hungary continues to strengthen its strategic dependence on autocratic powers. In this situation, the interests of Hungary and its government clearly diverge. The interest of the country is to settle the relationship with the EU and allies, fulfill the anti-corruption conditions of the EU development funds, and reduce our economic and energetic dependence on any authoritarian powers. Viktor Orbán's government has the opposite interest, to get money in a non-transparent manner without anti-corruption and rule of law conditions, to supply the economic hinterland with orders without competition, and increase the Prime Minister's political influence as a European representative of the illiberal authoritarian powers. In my opinion, the contrast between national interest and government interest will remain with us until there is a change of government in Hungary and a force comes to power that represents a return to European values and strengthens Hungary's formal stable place in the Western federal system. Thank you very much for your kindest attention.